Okay, today we're going to talk about the start of the Cold War. Now, some of you may know that the Cold War went from 1945 all the way up to 1991. But today, we're just going to focus on the first part of that, how it all got started. So, that is only from 1945 to the 1950s. Okay? So, who are the major winners of the war? Of World War II, that is, not the Cold War. So, who came out on top? Well, if you think about it, the big three. You have Winston Churchill, you have FDR, and Joseph Stalin. Churchill represented Great Britain, FDR represented the United States, and Joseph Stalin represented Russia, or the USSR. Now, Churchill and England played a major role, but really the two major powers that came on top were FDR and Joseph Stalin, the US and the Soviet Union. So, they all got together at this conference after World War II ended, and they talked about what was going to happen with all these areas that Hitler had conquered that were now no longer under Germany's control. Well, FDR wanted each nation to decide what its government should be. So, a nation like Poland could decide, hey, we want to be a capitalistic society or we want to be a communist society. Well, Stalin wanted the nations near the USSR to be communist. He wanted Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania all to remain communist countries. Well, why would he want this? Well, he wanted to protect the USSR from the West with buffer nations. So, if there was ever a problem, like, another country rising up and trying to attack, it would take, that country a long time because they would have to go through all of these countries right here in order to get to the USSR. So, the question is all the other nations wanted to let them decide, the individual nations decide, but Stalin ended up getting his way. Well, what is one of the reasons that Stalin was able to get his way? Well, it was this. As you can see, each flag here represents an amount of soldiers that were killed. Now, the red flags up here represent Soviet soldiers that were killed, and the skulls represent the amount of civilian casualties. You can see that the Soviets had a far greater amount of casualties compared to, let's say, the United States or Great Britain or France. So, these casualties and these deaths led Stalin to get his way. So, what did this lead to? Well, everyone was afraid. The Western capitalistic countries are afraid of the spread of communism, and the communist countries are afraid of the spread of capitalism. What's everybody's response to this fear? Well, join alliances. In 1949, in the West, they formed NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And that included Belgium, France, UK, Denmark, Portugal, Canada, United States, Iceland, Norway, Italy, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. In 1955, the Soviets created the Warsaw Pact, which included Albania, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany. So we have the Soviets creating communist alliances on one side, and the Western states creating capitalistic alliances on the other. If one country was attacked, the rest would join in and help. That was the agreement. Sounds awfully familiar, doesn't it? Well, it sounds familiar because it's happened before with previous wars these alliances would come about right before a major war would break out. This leads us to the Truman Doctrine. Truman had the idea that he would give money to countries threatened by communism. What was the definition of threatened? Well, it wasn't very clear. And his idea was if he didn't stop communism from spreading right away, that we would face it in other places, like at home, maybe, in England or in the United States itself. So he thought, well, let's fight communism there, where it's at the start, rather than having it come all the way to us. So now this leads us to talk about what happened to Germany after World War II. Well, as you can see, Germany was split in two. The Western nations, like England, France, and the United States, controlled the western half, while the Soviets would control the eastern half. Now, also, Berlin, the capital of Germany, was split in two. While you can see, if you look closely, that Berlin, the western half of Berlin, would become under Western rule, and the eastern half would become Soviet rule. And so one side was communist, while the others were capitalist. So, this brings us to the Marshall Plan. The idea was, came about for a European recovery program, and it was presented by General George C. Marshall, and that became known as the Marshall Plan. The idea was to set aside $13 billion to help rebuild Europe. And the idea was, widespread, and it was offered to every country that was, devastated by World War II. But all the communist nations refused because they were afraid that that would give them a certain leeway over them. Like, oh, hey, remember we helped you out, so... That leads us to the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was a recovery program for after World War II. It was presented by General George C. Marshall, and it was named after him. The idea was to set aside $13 billion to help rebuild Europe. It was offered to every country that was devastated by World War II, but only the Western nations accepted the money and all the communist nations refused it. Okay, we have a couple of questions to ask ourselves now. First, why would the US do this? Well, if the US thought if they poured lots of money into these, countries that were devastated by World War II, that they would be less likely to fall under communist rule. Another question is what do you think was the result? Well, as you can see, that a lot of these Western countries were kept from falling under communist rule. They were able to, thrive and eventually become rebuilt. And even to this day, we find that a lot of the Western countries in Europe are more prosperous than the Eastern European countries. And the last question is how do they implement the Marshall Plan in West Berlin? If you remember, it's completely surrounded by the Soviets. So, what kind of ideas did they come up with? Well, they decided to fly it in. They decided, we'll fly in these supplies and this aid into West Berlin in order to get it to these people.